I'm sure there are a plethora of things that go through your mind when somebody says, tell me about a challenging time that you've had, or tell me about a time in your life when you were faced with adversity. Pinpoint that specific moment in that game and tell me exactly how you felt about that. And then if you won or if you lost and what the feeling was like. Instead of saying, well, one time at my job, a guy told me that I showed up late and I was very angry. You know, just sometimes you come up with these canned answers thinking that you've got to find this work-related experience, okay? So use your real life scenario, even if it's a situation where maybe you're dealing with family issues or something, and obviously we'll be mindful of the context and how to use that. But times when you actually were faced with some sort of adversity or conflict doesn't necessarily have to be job-related or work-related, because for some of us, we've gone from high school to college, and then we haven't had much work experience, so how are we going to use those experiences? So why are more employers using this method? They're matching your information more directly with requirements of the position. So it's helping to determine fact versus fiction. You're gaining an idea of how a candidate acts under pressure, justifies their actions, communicates verbally and non-verbally, and thinks on their feet. So I like to think that Northwestern Mutual was like on the cutting edge and have always kind of done this, but our philosophy is relationship-based individuals. We want somebody that we like. Obviously, you're going to want to buy from them because we do sell a product. And so we've always kind of looked for individuals that way, but according to Joe, multiple companies are starting to go that route. So for example, if we're sitting in an interview, typically we're face-to-face here, and what's your name? Lucas. So Lucas and I are interviewing each other, and we're kind of keeping our guard. Lucas is telling me these responses that he's Googled online. I may be telling him, here's what you can expect from us. But then there's all this stuff behind me that Lucas is like, yeah, but what does she really mean by that? Like, what's the compensation really like? And I'm saying, yeah, okay, Lucas is pretty cool, but there's something that he's not telling me. So what we need to start doing, and what we do as a company, and what a lot of companies are starting to do based on this national research, is we're kind of going this way. And I'm saying, hey, Lucas, here's who we are, here's what we have to offer. Here's the compensation. Let's figure out if this is in alignment with who you are. Now you tell me exactly who you are. There's complete transparency. We've kind of pulled back the curtain, and we're able to have a conversation to really identify if this is the right fit. What's your name? Tristan. Tristan and I were talking, he's going into pharmacy, and he's going to be interviewing for a pharmacy school. The reason why you want to go into pharmacy is a little bit different. I mean, you have a very detailed story of why you want to go into pharmacy. He was sharing that in the country, or in the county that he's in, there's a lot of drug abuse. And a lot of that had to do with pharmacies, and he wants to stop that. And he has specific examples of that. That is passion. That is a reason why you want to go to school. That is a reason why somebody is going to want to accept you into their program. If you went in there and said, well, pharmacists make a lot of money, and I like money. It's a transparent answer, but there's got to be some more depth to it. Because how do I know that maybe you decide you want to move on to something else? So you see where I'm going with that? And I think it kind of takes the fear out of the interviewing process when you just get to be real and be honest. So that being said, how to prepare for these interviews. And we can dive much deeper with some specific examples, and I'd love to be able to help if some of you are lining up interviews now, or if you have anything that you're working on, or maybe even industries that you're thinking about going into, and how I can help you best prepare for those industries. And I'll give you specific examples here in just a second. But analyze, think problem, action, resolution, and then practice. So again, I'm picking on the football player, but the football analogy, thinking through those times in your life, or maybe different games or scenarios that you had specific examples. If you are a, let me think through this really quick. If you're, let's say, a dancer and you're at a dance competition or something and you lost, think about the times in your life that were significant to you. Or maybe there was some sort of situation in school where you studied really hard for an exam and you failed it. But what was the lesson that you learned from it? So what I mean by that is when it says analyze and prepare, think through those different times in your life. Talk to your parents about it. Hey, they may be asking me some questions. Help me think about some things. So how to prepare, analyze, get an actual job description. So this is key, okay? So I've had so many people that I'll call back. They've applied to us. They've sent a really pretty cover letter. And I'll say, hey, I'm Nichole calling with Northwestern Mutual. Thanks for applying to us. What interested you in this position? What is this again? Okay, wait a second. Didn't you apply to me? You know, and so instantly I'm thinking, okay, this person clearly doesn't really care, or that's the impression that I get. So you see where I'm going with that? It's this transparency thing. It's this feeling like even if you don't remember, keep the conversation going and say, oh yeah, thanks for calling me back. So Nichole, right? With what company? Oh, okay, great. I caught him off guard, so that's fair. So if someone goes on to my website and they look at the job description and they know some key points about the job, and maybe you have a little folder that you set by your telephone, you're going to probably apply to a lot of jobs. Have the job description and have the questions that you have prepared sitting there. So when you're on the phone with the recruiter, you can say, hey, actually, yeah, I'm interested in this position, and I was just curious, is this full-time? I didn't see that on the job description. So researching the company, researching the position, knowing some statistics. When they say, what interested you in Northwestern Mutual? What interested you in Mylan? Oh, well, they're the #1 producing yada, yada, bleedy, blee. So hopefully that makes sense to you, getting some statistics and facts. You may have some statistics on the pharmacy school. Why do you want to go? What's so great about it? Anybody else have any specific companies that they're excited about interviewing with, or maybe a career path that they plan to go down? Anybody? I'll just share with you, when I moved to West Virginia, I was going into pharmaceutical sales. And so I interviewed with Daiichi Sankyo. And prior to that, I luckily had a friend who was in the business, and she shared with me, oh man, you got to do your research. You got to do your homework. I had to create a brag book, which was essentially all of my accolades or records and things that I had accomplished throughout my career. So it was like an accelerated resume. I had to have letters of recommendation, and all of these things I had prepared prior to ever applying for the position. So I knew enough about the company, I knew enough about the career to be completely prepared. I also went online, and a lot of forums are out there and things like that for specific companies and questions that they'll ask you, and I practiced and practiced and practiced. And I figured out specific situations that they may be asking me about so that I could tell my story. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? You all good? Okay, cool. So what skills are necessary to perform this type of role? So do I fit the mold? Am I the right fit? So if you're looking at, going back to the pharmaceutical sales, well, have I had experience in sales? Am I just shooting in the dark here? Do I just want to be in pharmaceutical sales? I'm probably going to get turned down if I don't have something to back it up. So that's a great way to identify, do I have what it takes? And maybe I have to take a different route in order to get to where I want to be. So for me, knowing that I wanted to eventually be in pharmaceutical sales, I started a career in sales, if that makes sense. So how to prepare problem, actions, and results. The problem, what problem or challenge were you faced with? What actions did you take, and what resulted from your action? What benefits did the employer see afterward? So we may be beating a dead horse a little bit here, but I can't emphasize this enough. When someone is a behavioral-based interview or a situational interview, is they're going to ask you, tell me about a time when you've been faced with a challenge. Or what is, 5 years from now, where do you see yourself? How do you describe yourself? Give me some adjectives that you describe yourself with. And how have you overcome a specific work challenge? Or maybe they'll ask you a specific scenario. So are you prepared to answer those questions? Have you thought through who you are? And when we talk about preparing, something that I like to recommend to students is sitting down and thinking about, what am I good at? What have I done in the past? And jotting them down. Maybe you were really great in school in a certain class and people were asking you for help, and how did that make you feel? And maybe you were called upon by a professor to tutor a student. Maybe at your job you were top sales at a retail store. And what were those sales like? know your numbers, know what you did well, and be able to produce that. That's really key. And I think going into the interview, you'll feel more prepared if you know those things and have practiced them enough so that when someone throws something your way, you're prepared for that. Practice, practice, practice. The more you practice, the more comfortable and confident you will be. I know that Hannah has many opportunities for you here to do mock interviews and to practice and to critique your resume and do all of those things. Practice with your friends. I cannot say that enough. And be prepared for everything. Google is such a wonderful tool and has so many wonderful resources of templated interviews. You can look at behavioral type of interview questions. I can share some with you that we use. And we've completely switched to behavioral type interviews. We're even diving so deep that we want to know about your family. We want to know about your upbringing. We want to know who makes you, because the more we know you, the more we're able to adapt and coach and mentor you to be better, because we're investing in you. So most companies are looking at things that way. It's no longer looking at churning and burning employees through. They're looking at how can we best help you and how can you best help us. So it's kind of exciting, but how to prepare, let's kind of read through this a little bit. Past and current responsibilities. Tell me about the responsibilities you had in your previous or current position. How did these responsibilities contribute to the department or company? So that's an example of a past and present or current responsibility. In your present or previous position, what's one aspect of your responsibilities you feel could be improved and why? So that's a really hard question because it's asking you to like critique yourself. So what do you say in a situation like that? Does anybody have any thoughts? Yeah. Awesome. Yep. So he said, talk about your weakness or area for improvement. I love that. And then how you're working on it. So for example, I know that I'm completely impatient and I will push things quicker than maybe they always needed to be pushed. So in a lot of ways, that's a weakness, yes, but it also can be viewed as a strength. So you can kind of frame it that way. I've had people say, well, I can't really think of anything. Don't say that. We all have a weakness. And I know it's hard because it's like, well, I don't want to tell them something gross about me. I don't want them to know that I have any kind of weakness. But being able to identify and critique yourself and identify those weaknesses and where you're looking to strengthen it is actually a real strength. So let's look at achievements. What achievements are you most proud of at your present or previous position? And how did they contribute to the department or company? Again, for some of you, how many of you have had jobs thus far? So a good portion of you, some maybe not, but really you'll have to dial this back to school. And so you're going to have to dive a little bit deeper into this, or what achievements are you proud of? I mean, pull up some old test scores, pull up your classes that you excelled in, pull up maybe accolades that you've won if you're on the honor roll and things like that. For your jobs, I mean, don't belittle a part-time job at Wendy's. You know, if you were the sales rep and sold the most Frosties in one day, I mean, remember that and write it down so that you can bring that up, because that's pretty awesome. It's just the context in which you were working. Project examples. Tell me about a specific task or project where you had to use problem solving. What was the task or project, and what action did you take, and what was the result? So this is kind of an in-depth question. Do you see what I'm saying? People are going to ask you these questions, and it's like, whoa, I can't think of anything right off the top of my head. Take a breath. I'm going to think about that for just a minute. And then go back to what you practiced. So if it were me, you know, I'd write a little list. This situation, and then just maybe how you handled it so that you're prepped for these kinds of questions. So give me some examples of standards you use in your tasks to ensure the quality and quantity of your work. How did you use these standards, and what measurable results did you have? So again, another in-depth question. They want to know specific scenarios. So that's when it comes back to behavioral issues. So When we call it a behavioral-based interview, they want to know how you're responding under pressure, how you respond to situations. Do you take a step back? Do you act and then think about it later? Or are you a more process-driven person? Well, I sat down and I created a spreadsheet to identify, all right, based on the metrics of my performance, yada, yada. Or, hey, I really went after it for a month, and then I looked back to see what were my results. This was my plan of attack, and I was able to achieve X, Y, and Z. So having these numbers and tangible things that you're able to present is really important. Strengths and weaknesses. You may not be asked directly, but be aware of your strengths and weaknesses that you want to come forth. So again, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. So what did you learn? Anything? Anybody? Practice. Yeah. I'm a resource to you, so please pick my brain right now and ask me what's going through your mind. I know some of you may just be here for a class or whatnot, but you're going to be faced with an interview. I want to give some other suggestions that I hope will be helpful to you. As a young person, what we have to be mindful of as millennials, and this was a really fascinating piece that I didn't think about, is that you are used to instant communication. You're used to someone texting you back in 2 seconds. And I think the biggest challenge that a lot of young people face is you submit a resume, maybe you have an interview, and then you haven't heard back and it's been 4 days. Oh my God, I didn't get it. I'm moving on to the next thing. Remember who's recruiting you. Remember that it's a different generation, maybe even me, an older generation who was recruited by the older generation who learned from them, and just take a step back. I highly recommend getting your resumes looked at by someone here, use your free resources. I mean, that's so awesome. Have them help you go through it with a fine-tooth comb. If your email address is like Snoop Dogg 27 or whatever, change it. That was your high school email. Change it to something professional. Have a separate account for your email address. I cannot tell you how many emails I've seen that I'm like, what is this? No. So change your email address if it's not professional. And then submitting a cover letter is really key. But be transparent. Be honest in your cover letter. I'm not saying to do this, but one of the best kids I ever recruited had his face plastered on the front of his cover letter when he went to the career fairs. And it was this kind of fun picture. And I said, well, that's new. And he said, well, I didn't want you to forget me. That kid was #1 on my list because he was personal and he was friendly and he stood out. So when you're going around to these career fairs and you're talking to these different recruiters, do something to stand out. I mean, obviously your story stood out to me. Those types of things. It doesn't have to be goofy. It has to be something real. And with so many people, what is it? We're making up 34% of the workforce. There's a lot of competition out there. So what can we do to stand out? In the interview, when you accept the interview, always respond to the confirmation with a thank you email. I look forward to meeting you. Always following up. I know it's old school, but I'm still very, very impressed by handwritten thank you, although that's kind of not necessarily, I encourage it. You may not see it a lot anymore, but even an email thank you is very, very, it goes a long way. And then right now, we're using a lot of assessment tools, and I think you'll find a lot of companies are using those, so more of they're identifying your characteristics through different tests. We use a culture index assessment that a lot of companies use, as well as a career profile assessment. So don't be surprised if you get some different tests and asked to take those things. Take them as promptly as you can. During the interview process, I'm sure you guys have all kind of talked through wardrobe and attire and all of those things. But be professional. Make sure you own an iron. And if you don't, take it to the dry cleaner. It's $1.50 for a men's shirt. A tie, you know, if you have a business suit, they have little strings on the back. Cut the strings. They're not meant to be there. They have a little tag on the sleeve that comes off as well. Just little things like that. You know, if your shoes are dirty, just clean them off. Take them, you know, you don't have to pay a ton of money to go get brand new shoes. Just make sure they're clean. Wear dress socks with your shoes, gentlemen. I'll tell you a funny story. So I was interviewing this kid, and he was such a sharp dresser, and he came in and he was wearing dress shoes with no socks. And I was like, gross, what is that about? Is that a thing? And I thought his feet had to be so sweaty. Well, I had to get to the bottom of it. So I went down to the Nordstrom shoe department, and turns out it's very European. So if you want to rock no socks with shoes, it's very brave, but it is a thing. So like I said, I've kind of seen it all. I've also seen sports socks with dress shoes. Not okay. When you sit down, they will show. So be mindful of that. And for women, I would say business suit is always a go, but anything kind of more trendy is great. Hannah is a great example of trendy business attire. But be aware of going too far with the trends. I mean, you definitely want to keep it pretty modest until you realize the culture of the company. If you're going to a company like Google or something, obviously things are going to be different. But especially here in a traditional area, in West Virginia, I would stick with something pretty conservative and traditional. And then, let's see, during the interview, be yourself. I can't think of anything else to say that really sums it up except for being yourself and practicing and making eye contact and not getting knocked down if you don't get the job. You have to kiss a lot of frogs in order to find your prince, in my opinion. So you may interview a lot of companies before you find the one that you want to be with. But questions for me, what's going through your minds right now? Like, what's your biggest concern, or do you have any fears about interviewing? Are you worried about it? Are you excited about it? Somebody just shout something out. How about you? Uh-huh. If you go blank? Yeah, so if they ask you a question and you go blank, that happens. And I mean, this is where the practice comes into play, because if you've written down a lot of scenarios and looked over them, hopefully you'll be able to come up with something. And if you can honestly say, I am drawing a complete blank, can we come back to that? And when people say that, I'm like, heck yeah, we can. And then I'll circle back to it. Or you can say, okay, I'm ready to circle back to that question, because they may ask you something else that's going to get you somewhere else. So you're like, oh yeah, going back to that question, that could probably relate to this one. So does that help a little bit? Yeah. Yeah, good. What other questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you can use any life scenario. I mean, I know that for some of us, we've worked at a job that we didn't really love. It didn't really challenge us. I mean, we just went every day. We got our paycheck. But man, you were a good soccer player, and every day you were at practice, and you loved playing in those games. And or you are a really good tennis player, and you had an awesome match because you strategically thought through how to beat your opponent, and you won the match. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I would be more excited to hear about than, well, this one time I was at work and this girl, if you get really jazzed about something and it's a tennis match, ping pong match, whatever, ping pong match, bring it up, talk about those things. But obviously keep it in the context of the question. So just being sure that you're bringing it back, saying, well, this, and you can even say, this may sound different, but I'm thinking about my athletics career. Or I'm thinking about my academic career when you ask that question. I can't really think of anything at my part-time job, but here's what here's where I think it relates. So, good question though. Yeah. How about any others? Who has any interviews coming up? Pharmacy school? Nice. How about anybody else? Where at? Oh, yes, my favorite store. Which Nordstrom?
It's in Pittsburgh.
Okay.
It's like a retail management, so it's definitely a lot of sales, but then you also in the back and you're kind of working people that are higher up in the HR.
Yep.
Corporate, you kind of go to meetings. My interview was with 5 actual HR people, so it's a little
Like a panel?
Because you have 5 people asking questions and 1 question and stuff like that. But,
Tell us about that, if you don't mind. He had an interview with, can everybody hear him? He had an interview with Nordstrom and had a panel of 5 interviewers. So, like, did they switch off asking you questions? What were some of the questions you got asked?
it
Mhm.
was very similar or exactly the same. I actually had a mock interview with Koenig before,
Sweet.
about a week before, so I had a lot of those similar questions as well. So I think I I was able to answer all the questions, and I feel that the right context as well. So I think I did well with it. And then they had you do other things, like they had you go on the floor and sell them items and
Oh.
either try and sell them to a customer or stuff like that, like kind of get you like right into it. So that was kind of nerve wracking. And then at the end, they asked me if there were any questions, so that I had to make sure I asked not every one of them, but enough to
Sure.
yeah. So it was a little nerve wracking, but at the same time, I've had my fair share of interviews, so I felt I wasn't that nervous, I guess.
Good.
Yeah.
What did you know about Nordstrom going into it? Did you know?
I knew a little bit about it. I mean, just from being, I guess, a shopper there, I knew it was very, it's a higher end retail. It's very successful. It started off in, I think, Seattle with like shoes or something, and I kind of talked about that with the others. I had done research
Mhm.
for it, kind of looked it up and stuff. So I knew it was a very successful and good retail store. So I kind of went with that, and I figured that one.
Nice. Did you get the job?
I hear back from this week. So
Nice.
I'll
Be
find out.
patient.
Yeah.
Be patient.
Yeah.
Well, I'm from Washington State, so I bleed Nordstrom.
Okay.
I love Nordstrom. And one cool thing about Nordstrom is that they're so customer service based that I'm sure they were looking for responses from you that were, how would you help the customer? So that's another cool thing. When you know enough about the company, and he's probably always thinking in the back of his mind, it's a high retail end store that's big on customer service. So every answer that I have is probably customer service based. For individuals that we recruit, it's the same thing. If they're talking about their past work experience and how it was always about putting the customer first, or putting their family first, or whatever that's really important to them, that's a big, big, awesome plus for us. So knowing enough about the company is really, really great. Plus, you probably wanted to, maybe you didn't wear socks. Did you wear socks?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you could have pulled it off at that interview. Yeah. Cool. So any other questions or thoughts? Anybody else do any interviews recently? Or have you had a really horrible interview? Yeah?
Last year was one of my favorite processes, I guess, interviewing. And I've had different times. So there's one, it was even virtual, my first one. They had one on the internet where you're doing video and you see yourself, which makes you like really kind of nervous.
Yeah.
You see your facial actions, you don't know how they're responding to you. But that wasn't the one. The one I had was a telephone one. So you don't know how they're looking at you. You don't know their facial expressions. You don't know how they're doing. So I feel like I did really bad.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the things. I didn't end up getting it because after I even hung up the phone, I was like, oh, there's something I can do. So I think after that one, I kind of go into interviews like, I can't give that type of interview again, but
Yep.
when you see someone's facial expressions, it helps because even as Hannah Jonathan said, you'll see them move forward and write down notes, which helps you because they're intrigued and they're listening to what you're saying, and if they lean back and they're kind of stay away from you and avoiding you, and you feel like that they're not that into you, or
Right.
not really reading what you're saying.
That's a really good point. Phone interviews, it's a whole nother beast. I do a lot of phone interviews, and I always ask that they be at their computer screen and be prepared, because I'll usually email some things that we'll discuss throughout the interview. I had a kid yawn on the phone during my interview, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, are you bored?" And he said, "Oh, no, I'm sorry." But he just didn't think about it, because he was at home. So you have to think about it. I even recommend putting a dress shirt on, sitting at your desk, whatever it may be, and like being prepped like you're in an interview, because you can tell when somebody is bored or if somebody's not engaged. Smiling, you can stand up during your interview. Some of you may get phone interviews, especially if you're interviewing outside of the state, because before they invest in you flying out there or whatever, they may want to interview you over the phone. So that's a good feedback, though. Sounds like you've had some good experience thus far. Let me know if you get Nordstrom. Let me know if you get Nordstrom. So if you get a discount, be your best friend. Awesome. So how about any other questions or anything? Obviously, I want this to be geared towards what you guys are focused on and worried about or have going through your mind. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Good question. So I always like to know where are they from. Tell me a little bit about your family. You know, I have X amount of siblings. We're from this region. My parents are in this business. I went to college here. Maybe you played X sport. For me, I didn't play sports, but I was involved in different things academically, as well as I worked throughout high school. So I would share that information. You know, really anything that's pertinent to who you are. So what you like to do for fun, where I'd probably leave it at that, you know. And then you'd say, is that what you wanted to know? And you can ask a question. Is there anything else? You know, and they'll say, no, that's great, that's great. But let them know a little bit about you, kind of where you came from, your background, and kind of leave it at that. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah.
When they ask you if you have any questions for them, like I've thought about recruitment. You know, when like the interviewer asks me like, okay, do you have any questions for us? What's like I do?
If you have any questions? Well, if you have any legitimate questions, certainly ask those questions. You know, that's hard because some of the times I feel like you're in an interview and you almost black out a little bit, like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what just happened. But if you can center yourself and kind of take a breath and think through some of the questions that maybe you've thought about before you got there. I've had people, and I appreciate it when they write questions down, have a notebook or something, and then they'll say, well, actually, I brought some questions if you don't mind. They'll look at it and say, okay, I think you answered that one. I think we got that one. I had this question as well. Maybe you could dive a little bit deeper into that. And be careful with the questions being too many of them, because chances are they've probably just reviewed a lot of information with you. But have some specific questions that you figured maybe they won't ask. So, for example, you know, someone may say, what's a typical day like for this position? Well, they're probably telling you a little bit more about the role. So you could say, you had talked about the typical day, but I'm curious to know, you know, are my expectations to work out of what office? You know, and just diving into some deeper questions. If you have any cultural questions, you know, you can say, what's the culture like here? What do you like about working for whatever X, Y, and Z company? That doesn't hurt to ask those questions. You're just as much interviewing them as they are you, and it shows that you're engaged and excited to make sure it's the right fit for you as well. So, good question. Yeah. Yeah. How to what? How do you conduct a phone interview over face-to-face? Yeah. So it's kind of the same thing. I go through a series of questions, and then typically I will say, I want to switch gears and talk to you more about the company, and I'll have a PDF that I've emailed them. So we'll kind of go through the different pages together. And usually what I try and do after that initial phone interview, because typically you won't go through a full selection process over the phone. You'll go through that initial screening process. For example, one of the first interviews with Daiichi Sankyo for me was over the phone with somebody that wasn't even related to Daiichi Sankyo. It was just a simple screening interview, which you may get for some bigger organizations. And then from that point, they'll determine whether or not you move to a face-to-face interview. So it's the same thing in that initial phone interview, being transparent, having that, you know, jovial conversation if you can, trying to be real, even though you can't be with somebody face-to-face, it can be a little tricky, but same thing. Yeah, good question. And I would even ask prior to the meeting, if you haven't been prepped with anything to look at, you could say, is there anything that you'd like for me to pull up online or be prepped with prior to our conversation? So that's a good question to ask. What other questions? These are all good questions. Anybody else have any horror stories or awesome stories about interviewing? Yeah.
So, at the end of the interview, they ask you, are you interviewing with any other companies? What do you think is the best answer for that question?
Honesty, if you're interviewing with other companies. What that tells me is that we have some competition, and I got to move if I want you. So it's not a bad thing. And knowing that you're looking at other companies helps me identify what you're looking for. Because if I'm talking to somebody that's just talking to everybody, this kid wants a job. If I'm talking to someone that you're talking to Macy's, you're talking to Nordstrom, you're talking to some really dedicated high-end retailers, I know that you're interested in that market. So, yeah, be transparent. Good questions. Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay. Mm-hmm. So she's asking in an international situation, now would they know that you're only working for a year, the company? That you're kind of saying, should I tell them if I can only work for a year? That's really tricky. I think it depends on the job in which you're applying to. In my opinion, honesty is always the best policy. I am only working for my company for 2 years, and he still hired me. So I came from Washington State, and I'm only in West Virginia for a short amount of time, and he knew that from day one. He still chose to hire me. I also have opportunities now because I was honest. So I would say be honest, and if the right position is going to appear. All the other jobs that I got when I was in West Virginia, they all knew when I was leaving. So yeah, I think it just depends on who you're applying to and what you're looking for. Because if you're only here for a year, do you really want something that you're going to want to stick with? Or are you looking for something to help you gain experience and you can let them know that? I'd definitely say be pretty honest with your plans. Yeah, because maybe they have the perfect temporary position for you as a staff role or something where you're gaining some experience and you're filling a need for them, but then they know that you're going to leave. So does that help? Yeah. Yeah, good. And if you don't have plans to stay, be honest too. I mean, my boss has asked me numerous times if I'd stay, and I don't have any plan to stay. I love where I'm from, so I'm certainly going back there. It's nice for them to know that they don't have the opportunity to keep you. Does that make sense? Cool. Questions? Anybody else? We can wrap it up if necessary, but please feel free to reach out to us. I can leave a card if you have any specific questions. Nikki Koenig is with me, if you don't mind standing up. Nikki is our director of our internship program, and she might look familiar to some of you. She's been on campus quite a bit lately and working with Hannah, and she is focused on our internship program. So we hire interns to test drive the career in financial services. So if at any point you're interested, you're more than welcome to talk to Nikki. And I actually work out of our Huntington office, but I'm around as well. So thanks for your attention. Good luck in your career search. I hope this helped. And if we can be a resource to you, please let us know.